Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us again. This is the second of our CPD sessions in history. And with the final exams of that old syllabus having just taken place, we're now talking about preparing your first cohort for those first exams of the new specifications, which begin this November in the new school year. We're absolutely delighted to welcome again Bob Pace, recently of Belmont School, and our wonderful team leader for history. The aim of these sessions is to support you delivering the new specifications for CE, and this one is going to focus on reflecting on year one with that cohort and preparing for year two, teaching that new history specification. He's also going to include some ideas for planning schemes of work, and also you can have a Q&A with Bob. This webinar is a sequel to the previous Twilight session that we held in March. So we're delighted if we're welcoming lots of you back here again to listen to the wonderful Bob speak about this spec. I'm sure you're going to enjoy the session. And just another reminder that you can find us on social media at ISEB Awards on all channels. It would be lovely to see you and talk to you. So as soon as this session's finished, just as before, there are going to be time for questions. Please use the chat function in YouTube. I will just drop something in there. You can see Richard and I have already been chatting on there. If you're finding that chat function isn't accessible to you, it will be because you're not logged into YouTube. So if you log in, or you are able to log into YouTube or create a YouTube account, you will find that chat is available to you. You can post any questions you have there. What we will do is Sophie and I will have a look at them as they come in, and we will ask those questions to Bob at the end. But a huge thanks to lots of you who sent us questions beforehand as well that you really wanted addressed. So we're going to cover those too. So without much further ado, let me hand you over to Bob.
Well, hello, I'm Bob Pace. As I said, I'm the chief setter or leader of the history setting team. And I'm going to talk today about reflecting on year one and preparing for year two on the common entrance. And if I could have my first slide. There we are. And the next one, please. Right. So as Julia mentioned, the first exam, the last exam of the old system is done 2 weeks ago. That means no longer do you have to worry about, will they try to say, for example, Mary I is a religious figure, because that won't be the kind of question that comes up anymore. Will you have to worry about them answering the wrong time period for a question? No, that isn't going to be an issue anymore, because now the essays are very, very specific on time and topic. So where do we stand getting ready for this? Well, Galore Park has now published a new textbook based on this exam. ISEB did not write it, but we approved it. There is a new revision guide near completion. And the example questions and answer book is actually already been published, because I have copies of it. So I suspect if not already out, it will be out very, very soon. So next slide, please. What questions can you expect as you set your pupils on the task of getting ready for the exams next academic year? Well, the specifications now detail the question topics. No more guessing. We know that in the first term in November for medieval, it's going to be 3 questions of essays, either Battle of Hastings, Eleanor of Aquitaine, or development of castles. And we know in the spring, it's going to be the Battle of Agincourt, Richard III, monasteries and nunneries. The only thing you're not absolutely sure of at the moment is which of those 2 will be there in the summer exam. That means that if you've studied, your children, your pupils, have studied Battle of Hastings and Battle of Agincourt, for example, they know one of those is going to be in the summer exam. The same goes with the Making of the UK, where it's the Spanish Armada and Henry VIII and the Church. Notice the dates, 1520 to 1560. This was somewhat arbitrary, but there had to be a limit to how far you could take this, because of course, this topic could go for a lot longer time period than that. Then Battle of Benham, James II, first settlements in America. And finally, Britain and Empire, Autumn Battle, Quebec, George III, anti-slave trade movement, Spring, Battle of Waterloo, Benjamin Disraeli, women's suffrage. Next slide, please. So what do you expect in each section of one of these essays? First, A will ask for two key points. That's done very specifically. I suspect you know how some of your pupils who've learned the story well could get very excited and spend their entire time on the essay simply writing the story. This is only worth 8 marks. Could be a disaster. Therefore, very specifically, it asks for 2 key points. For example, 2 key events in the Battle of Hastings, which might be that Harold decided to set up his line on the ridge, Sinlick Hill, and then you could argue it was William's possible decision. Of course, this is still somewhat controversial, but possible decision to have his troops pretend to retreat and draw Saxon troops down. Those would be the 2 key events. B, we'll ask for a judgment about the most important cause, event, consequence within the topic. For example, the most important decision Harold made before the Battle of Hastings. So that's looking at causes, causes. And the usual one that comes out at this point would be, they would say, in my judgment, the most important cause or event within decision made before the Battle of Hastings was rushing down from Stamford Bridge and not waiting, or simply going up to fight at Stamford Bridge. You could work on that, but that's the sort of idea. Again, 8 marks. So we're not looking for a huge amount, a paragraph. C, we'll give a statement and ask for how far the candidate agrees. For example, William the Conqueror won the Battle of Hastings because of dumb luck. I don't think we'll probably use those words exactly, but this is the real core of this essay question. This is where your pupils can show their true understanding. This is where they should be working at developing an argument. For example, William won the Battle of Hastings because of brilliant generalship. This is because causes. But on the other hand, it could be said that he won because he was lucky. And then that could bring in Stamford Bridge, the fact that when the wind blew, all these sort of things could play a role in that answer. Now, there's no doubt that your pupils are going to need to practice how to write each of these sections. The advantage is they are sections. So there's no huge essay. Now 3 sections. So a mistake on one, even the last one, won't necessarily be an absolute disaster as it would have been in the old system. Next slide, please. So that is the evidence. That is where the essays, where we know what the information is. Then there is the evidence, and this is quite a change from what you've been working with until now. First of all, on 2 sources. None of them very long for a specific reason. This is only 20 marks. This is not meant to be half of the exam. A will ask for a single point from the first source. We're talking about a sentence. So basically, do they comprehend the first source? B will ask for a comparison between the 2 sources. Now, this is a little bit more challenging. They're going to have to be able to pick out, do they agree or disagree, and to some extent how, but it's only 4 marks. We're only talking about a couple of sentences. C, again, is the meat of this. We'll ask the key question about the utility or usefulness of the sources concerning a specific question. This will also need reference to reliability. So if there are two sources on, for example, I don't know, Jamestown, Virginia, on the making of the UK section, perhaps about Pocahontas, and one talks about the story of John Smith and being saved by Pocahontas, and the other one, the first one from, let us say, a contemporary account, the second, even John Smith's account, and the second one from a modern historian doing a study which shows that it was primarily made-up story. They need to then be able to look at these two and say, well, if the question is, how important was Pocahontas to the story of Jamestown, then they would be able to say, well, the first one says that, yes, she saved John Smith, but we know that this is not a particularly reliable source. Yes, it was done by the man, but we know, because it would say this in some of the information above, that he had a tendency to brag. On the other hand, the modern historian, who has done a lot of study and an overall view, says that this was a mythical story, and that though she played a role, it wasn't this. And that possibly is more useful because it is more reliable. So this is the sort of things your kids will need to work on. And as I say here, it's definitely something that needs to be in your teaching plans, irrespective of the topic you were covering. I have talked to some teachers who gave me the idea they were going to do this part of preparing for the exam, sort of last minute, just stick it in. I'm here to talk about how you should be planning for this exam next year and the years that come. You need to practice this sort of work on whatever topic you are doing. Doesn't make any difference if it has nothing to do with the common entrance. If you're working with history and you're doing with the sources material, two sources usually conflicting, but with information about who produced it. And that is what the children, the pupils need to work on to learn how to analyze and evaluate. It is not an easy skill, but it is a skill that can be learned. And you might be surprised how well at least some of them take this in. Next slide, please. So, this slide is about content, but what I want to put in first is this exam is much less about content than the exams we've just finished. The evidence is a clear example of this because the evidence isn't based on any topic content they have studied. It is a sight unseen. It could be on any topics, obviously ones they can understand, which we'll make sure, but they're more than likely going to be either pre-1066 or post-1914. Not necessarily always, but probably. The fact is they need to learn how to deal with the information. In the essays, it's really important they understand how to deal with the questions. And this could be practiced on absolutely any topic you study. And I think it should be. So let's go to what the slide says. Much of this depends upon the way you have decided to tackle the content needed for the essays. It is certainly possible to just pick one topic area in one time period and spend a whole academic year just covering those two questions. For example, William I and Thomas Becket. This could be done in year 7 and another 2, such as Elizabeth I and Charles I in year 8. Now I'm talking about you would have already been doing William I and Thomas Becket if you do medieval in year 7 this academic year, and then the other 2 next academic year. You could do this. I think you would bore your children. I think you'd bore yourself too. The whole point of the way the exam has now been established or set up is that it's much less content material needed. It's much more understanding the skills of how to deal with it. So it is very possible to not really try to cover any of the specification topics specifically in preparation for the essays in year 7, only focus on them in year 8, and possibly doing it in a long term or a term and a half at the most, getting enough to do what you need. Otherwise, you have the freedom to treat this as you wish. This is why I said it is equally possible to build a much broader syllabus, focusing on the skills needed at first, then spending part of year 8 on your chosen topic. Because the topics are guaranteed, this approach is far more possible and safe or safer than before. You're not gambling on a particular open essay that would fit. You know what the essays are going to be. Which leads us to the next slide, please. The key point in preparing pupils for this exam is that they must learn how to analyze and make judgments about whatever content you choose to concentrate on. Okay, so here is an example. An interesting topic in 2023 to 2024 is the development of the railways, 1800 to 1830. For those who might do this subject or this topic, again, 1830 seems arbitrary, and it is to some extent. But again, it is limiting the amount of content that you have to deal with. Post-1830, obviously, is the huge explosion of the railway system. But this is looking specifically at its beginnings and the first figures involved with it. So what would you need your pupils to be able to deal with in terms of information? What are the causes of the development of the railways? So you'd be thinking about transportation, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, other factors like this, which can be argued to be the most significant. This is an opportunity to get your pupils thinking and working, perhaps in groups, dealing with a series of causes and trying to work out amongst themselves and in the class what could be considered the most important and why. So it gives all sorts of chance of work within the class, getting them to think this out. So the next question or next thing is, who are the key individuals involved? What are their most important action achievements? All right. Again, in this topic, it's Richard Trevithick, it's George Stephenson, it's his son, Robert Stephenson. These are key figures. And again, they need to know something about their background and how successful, unsuccessful they were, like Trevithick working with rotary action of the steam engine and steam under pressure, and how he did some of the very earliest work down in Cornwall, and then how his career rather petered out, how George Stephenson takes a role in all of this, how his son becomes a key part of it and possibly a more important part of it. These are the sort of things they'll need to be able to know and to work with. What are the key events during this period? What can be judged the most important? Well, it could be Trevithick and his earlier experiments, or his running of Catch Me Who Can in London. It could be George Stephenson setting up some of the earliest railways, the Liverpool to Manchester. It could be Robert and George with the rocket. Here are things that you can come out and work again with the kids, get them to think about this. Where is that key event that they could judge as part of the exam? What are the consequences? What could be judged the most important? And again, here again, they need to be thinking about and going through what are the good and bad consequences. Some people are going to lose their jobs. The canals are going to be put under pressure. The stagecoach lines are going to eventually fade away. But of course, then there are those who will get new jobs out of this. Unfortunately, because it's 1830, we can't talk about things like railway time and so, but you can still, there's plenty here to talk about the consequences and generally how the railway revolution caused a revolution in the life of Britain. Next slide, please. So you could pick a specific topic, like we've talked about 2 topics and spend a whole year on it. Wouldn't do that. If it was me, I'd be looking at what I want to use through all these topics, because it's a 3-year rotation, and we're certainly going to do it twice through, and I suspect it'll go at least 3 times through. So you can be thinking ahead, because you don't want to have to keep changing everything you're teaching every year. That's going to be a little bit of a bind. I'd be tempted, if I was teaching, for example, medieval life in year 7, and I did want to get some work on the exams so they could do some practice exams, I would do something in a medieval life that could fit in an awful lot of the topics. The plague, the growth of towns, the monasteries, the castles, just being specific on life, not looking at specific battles or individuals. You could just as easily do that by looking at specific monarchs, which is a traditional way of going through medieval history. And obviously, you know that over the cycle, different ones will come up, and you can just make sure that for that year group, you focus on that one specifically as you work your way through. Easily can be done with Tudor monarchs, going to the making of the UK. Same with Stuart monarchs. Again, Henry VIII, Mary I, Elizabeth certainly are there, as are a number of others. And same with the Tudors and Stuarts. So it's very easy to organize around that, where all you do is you have a general routine of what you're running through, but you know that you're going to spend a little bit more time on specific ones, and the other ones will fade in the back. And the next year, another one will be more specific, and the other ones will get less coverage. And that would be one way of not necessarily having to totally disrupt what you do every year. Industrial change, again, is another one. The growth of empire is another good one. So I think a little bit of thought could make your life a lot easier in terms of having to constantly change what you teach each year. Yes, after 3 years, you've got it set up for the next 3 and the next 3. And that would work too, but that's a lot of work when you could do it, I think, this way with a lot less hassle for you. There are also opportunities to link up with other subjects and attempt some coordination. And I know that some history is taught is more of humanities with things like geography, and that really could lead to some very interesting connections. For example, if you decide what you want to do is work on battlefields, which is a perfectly good topic because there are going to always be 2 battles in each year. When you look at the battles, let's say Agincourt, you really should be looking at the physical geography of it, because that had such a major role into what happened. The same with, let's say, the Battle of Quebec. In fact, every single battle. Therefore, there is a good chance to do some map work and some other work with your geography colleagues. The Industrial Revolution is another one that fits very neatly in working with physical geography. And also human geography and things like the growth of towns and things like that. So there is a real possibility of coordination there with them. Medieval and making of UK topics, so important is religion at that time period, and very easy to connect up with religious studies, because I often find, depending on the school you're in, the pupil's background knowledge of Christianity could be limited. Therefore, working with religious studies could be very valuable. Also, their understanding of Islam may be limited. And again, if you're doing crusades, helping with help from religious studies could be very useful indeed. Science and maths. Now, this could be linked. You would think castle building with science and maths, because castles work with geography, but in terms of structure, size, angles of attack, all sorts of things like that, definitely with science and maths. Clearly, bubonic plague and other diseases can fit in with science, be it bubonic plague, be it cholera in the Victorian period, real chances to work along with the science department. What we're trying to do with this new exam is not try to tie you down to a very few topics, but to try to open you up so that you can do a lot of other things, and then make sure to do the exam, just make sure you just covered enough really for 2 questions in 1 topic would be enough, because you know one of them is guaranteed to come to get you through. Definitely you can do more if you want to. Definitely you can use it as a guide to how you want to teach other things. But the idea is you shouldn't have to simply tie yourself to just working on those topics all the way through. You can do more with it if you want, but you don't have to study them to the depth you need for the exam, and or other things. I've said so many times before, in my time of teaching, I've done anything from the Renaissance in Italy to North American Indians, who certainly didn't fit the common entrance of any time, and still managed to find time to do the things needed for the common entrance. This exam, as it's set up now, the specifications, should make that actually easier for you to do. Next slide, please. Oops. One thing we want to talk about here is there is another way of dealing with joint work other than like this. It is to work with something that ISEB have recently created called the IPQ. And at this point, I'm going to turn back over to Julia, who's going to talk to you a little bit about it.
IPQ was something that ISEB started, it must have been about 18 months ago now, and this year we've had lots of schools taking it. It's a project qualification. It's currently available for those in years 7 and 8. That's relevant for those of you here today talking about CE. We're also going to be branching that out there from September for any schools that also have pupils in year 5 and 6. And the aim of the IPQ is to be a great complement to CE, actually. And where we know that schools, perhaps there's more pressure on them around humanities subjects, arts, arts-based subjects and other sort of sporting subjects and physical subjects, actually the IPQ is a lovely way to bring cross-curricular activity together as well. So what we've done is it's a project-based qualification. For those in years 7 and 8, that's an individual qualification. Now, schools have used this in a number of different ways. Some schools have used this as a way of bringing particularly geography and history together. Other schools have used it for the creative arts. I've also had a school quite recently, I moderated those over the weekend, who are using this for religious studies. And what children are doing with this is thinking of their own project. So some schools are using it in a curricular way, and it's really linked to a subject. Others have used it for scholars. Others have used it actually for extracurricular activities. And some schools have decided to leave it completely up to the pupils as well. What the project entails is there are 5 different elements to that. They have to envisage a project. They then have to research it, create it, define what it is that they're going to do. And then once they've created something, they actually need to present what it is that they've done and later on reflect on how it went. So actually the aim of the IPQ is that it's not just about the outcome, it's about that process. So for example, a pupil might have a project that they conceived of where the outcome or the thing they created isn't what they intended it to be, well, that's not going to affect their grade in any way. Actually, it's the way they talk about it. It's the way they recover from it. It's the way that they decide that actually they were going to start off doing this grand project. And the reality of creating it has meant that they've had to bring that down into something or refocus it. And actually, the aim of the IPQ is that this is very much about emulating the kinds of ways that we work later on in school, as they get into senior school, and then as later when they get into university and in the world of work. And so we're really using the IPQ as a great way to also teach project-based inquiry learning to younger pupils at the same time as their subject-based. What Bob and I have been talking about today is, well, how has he been aware of IPQ being used? And we were racking our brains to think about those that we've seen this year. But Bob and I were talking about the fact that it connects brilliantly with geography. So perhaps students have done things on how a landscape has changed over time. And I think any of us that live near a green area will be able to attest to the ways that our towns and villages have changed a huge deal over even the years that we've been living there. He was also talking about the fact that there are peoples that have used the IPQ when they are investigating the Industrial Revolution. So that really brings history and geography together. What is the impact socially, politically, culturally of historical events like this, but also what environmental, socio-cultural, town planning aspects, how has that impacted that too? We're also thinking about peoples that have explored the history of a subject that they're really keen on. So we don't necessarily have to use those themes and topics that are in CE. We could think about the history of science, the history of literature, what's the history of the instrument that you play. And pupils have done some wonderful historical inquiries that are really bringing things together in an interdisciplinary way. The way in which the IPQ works is that a school would register and you can choose the window. We recommend that if you're doing the IPQ 3, broadly aligned to Key Stage 3, if you're doing that in years 7 and 8, then it's about sort of 20 hours work on that inquiry project, and schools can spread that throughout the year or over a couple of years if they would like to. It's very much up to you. What we do is we moderate each and every one of those projects. Well, you will mark them. We will then moderate those as they come in to make sure that that sample is robust and that those marks are fair and can be awarded and they're consistent with what other schools have been doing. And then pupils are certificated. And what it gives them is something else that demonstrates another skill, something to talk about perhaps at interviews for senior schools. And we are getting more and more schools using us. So we've had, well, we're hoping to have nearly 1,000 students having gone through an IPQ by the time we get into next year. And those numbers are growing all the time. So it's worked as a brilliant complement. It's something you're very welcome to talk to either me or Sophie about later on. We will be running some IPQ and how to implement IPQ in your school webinars as well. And as we say, it serves as a brilliant complement to CE. Bob, is there anything around IPQ that you've experienced or particular topics you think might be brilliant? You know, I've talked very much about that interdisciplinary angle and the way in which we know that IPQ is brilliant. If you're looking at extracurricular as well, it allows a child to really engage with something they care about, something they think is wonderful. But Bob, how about on the more sort of pure history element? Are there any ideas there that you've seen? Well, I know we talked about the Tudors earlier as well, didn't we?
Well, I mean, local history work could go through IPQ very easily. How it connects up to national events. And of course, if you happen to live near Kett's Rebellion area or had a bubonic plague outbreak, there are all sorts of things like that. Or there's a nearby castle. That sort of work could connect. It's sort of the traditional project, but more in a sense.
So yes, the IPQ is a really great project way to engage pupils in history, particularly if you're also looking for additional ways of engaging with history. across the school as well as CE. It's a lovely compliment to that. So I know that we've had a huge amount of questions come in beforehand. So what I will do is, I'm not seeing any in the chat yet, but I will give those of you that would like to ask Bob and me, predominantly Bob, he is absolutely the expert, to come in and ask him any questions that you would like to. But to get us started, we've had lots and lots, and we're so grateful for them, come in from you guys beforehand. And so I've got a few here. So the first one, Bob, is, do I need to buy those textbooks you talked about? How do we engage with the exam? Is it only through the textbooks, or are there other resources and things available?
Right. Well, the textbook by Galore Park is written very much with the exam in mind. And it has the advantage of giving you exercises and so very much with the exam. But no, you don't have to have them. You just need the content necessary for your topic questions. The older textbooks, while they're still around, will be useful. There are some topics that you may struggle to find if you don't use the textbook, unless you're willing to go and do your own research, which I hope you will do anyway. But no, you don't have to. But for example, I have to say an interest here, because as myself and two other members of my setting team who produced the exam practice essays and answers, questions and answers. That is giving lots and lots of examples of how we perceive the kids should answer, the pupil should answer, including in some cases, in a few cases, complete levels 1, 2, and 3, not just the best answer. And we don't actually go and use the essay questions that will be in the actual exam. We've picked other topics so you learn the techniques. And it could be useful backup, but it's not absolutely necessary. Any teacher, in most history teachers, after you've worked for a while, you learn that you can pick your own stuff and you tend to pick and choose. And that's the same here. So no, you don't have to have them. I'm sure Galore Park won't be liking me saying that, but you don't have to have them. Useful, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. They're a brilliant and useful and deliberately written complement to the exam, but they also contain additional things. I know that Galore Park was really keen that they become a really great history resource for those even just referencing C. So I know that there's lots of other useful information contained in those too. Actually, just a quick aside from me, Bob, in a increasingly connected world where it's not always the textbook, are there any wonderful online or digital resources or places that you might recommend that you and your team have explored before?
Well, this is where I have to bow to people, to the younger members of my team who are more aware with that. I was more aware of that. I must admit, I'm a retired teacher now, so I don't tend to keep up with it. So I'll have to refer you to Claire, for example, the other speaker who put in lots of material when she talked about diversity. There are plenty of things I know you can find things from the British Library, from the Peer War Museum. There are all sorts of resources everywhere if you just look.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I can really vouch for you. The British Library website is absolutely full of brilliant, highly credible, really easy to engage with resources for a whole range of subjects. It really is fantastic. So yeah, I second you on that, Bob. And yes, for anybody that was with us before, the previous session that Claire did contained a lot of other resources. So again, do refer back to that if you're looking at resources. Now, we've had a really great question from somebody who's on our call right now, Bob, Rachel. Now, there's lots in it. It's a really wonderful question, but there's many parts. So what I'm going to do is, if you all forgive me, Rachel has asked the following. My first question is about the essay topics. When the syllabus states Battle of Hastings, will this mean that the question is just focused on the battle itself, or will there be questions about the rest of the Norman conquest, harrying of the north and so on? Similarly, there is a topic on William I in another cycle. Will this just involve questions on the Norman conquest, so the Domesday Book, harrying of the north, castles, or will it also include Hastings? So that's the first bit.
All right, good question.
Really
Battle of Hastings will undoubtedly include all the events of 1066, including the campaigns before. Consequences could, to some extent, go a little bit further, but no, it will not be looking at the Herring of the North or the rebellions or the Doomsday Book or so. William I will. William will also go back to his early career in Normandy too, so they have to be a bit aware of that too, and his difficult early starts. And yes, the Battle of Hastings will be there, but it will not be a major factor. It will just be a factor. It could be what was the most important event in his life. You could write about the Battle of Hastings, I suppose, but you could just as equally write about the Doomsday Book or something else. So I understand what you're saying, but no, Battle of Hastings will be very specific on that in a fairly tight chronological area. William is a much wider topic. Battle of Hastings will be there, but you won't be expected to know all the ins and outs of the Battle of Hastings for that.
Perfect. Great answer. So now we move on to the next part, which is, will the anti-slave campaign essay question, also expect the children to demonstrate knowledge of the slave trade, or will the question focus just on the work of the campaigners?
I think it will expect some work on the slave trade as cause of what's going on.
And does Important Women of the 19th Century include the work of the Pankhursts and the WSPU, or would that extend the time boundaries too far, although it does still fit the 1750 to 1914 range?
Probably, yes, it could. I think there will be a little bit of a fuzziness around the ranges there. That's probably going to be one of the very few questions where it will be more open, where they may not specifically ask for a specific person, but ask for an example of one. I'm just thinking how that's going to work out, because it's going to be a little difficult otherwise for anyone to prepare for that. So good question. And yes, I think it will include the Pankhursts, even though their suffragette movement is more of an early 20th century movement. Yeah, certainly the other suffragists would be in there.
And actually, there's a really brilliant question from Rachel here that's probably one for both of us, which is, as the essay questions are more specific and targeted than the questions on the previous CE papers, I wondered if each essay topic could have an essential information to teach, so we know we're covering content which will be assessed. So actually, indicative content, really, Bob, is what's being asked for. And that sounds like a brilliant idea to me, but what do you think?
Something to think about. That would be something that maybe the ISEB could think about publishing and looking at. Yeah.
We're really committed, Rachel, actually, to making sure we can produce lots of resources and be as helpful as possible. So that's one that Bob and I can take off with us. I really like the idea of indicative content. And, our aim is to make these exams as accessible and lively as possible. So what a great idea. Now, there are just a couple more parts. Rachel has...
This is a big question.
Absolutely great job on this, however she says, making sure I've got the right bit. As a more general question, just for my own interest, learning a little bit about... so she wanted to know a little bit about covering Agincourt and Hastings, or castles and monasteries in the same academic year. So she said, do we need to cover both battles, just in case the topic we choose isn't the one in the exam? Just so she's really asking, would you recommend sort of teaching Battle of Hastings or castles as one option, or Battle of Hastings or monasteries? So essentially, she's just talking about helping teachers plan more effectively. Yeah.
Well, if you think this is actually going to be a topic your pupils will attempt on the exam, you really do need to do the pair. So Hastings and Agincourt. If this is simply preparation work, getting them used to it, and you're thinking, next year I'll make sure I've covered the topics that I really think they should do in the exam, then you could mix them any way you wish. So that, I understand what you're saying. And if this is year 7 you're talking about, if this is year 8, then it's very different, and you are going to have to pair them up. If it's year 7, you could still do it, and there's still a chance it could show up, but of course it's no longer guaranteed. So my answer is, if this is absolutely what they're going to do in the exam, they need to pair it. If it isn't, then yes, you could mix it quite happily with the knowledge that it may not provide the question they need at the end, and you're going to make sure they have it in year 8.
Great. So, what have I got next? Are some exam topics harder or easier than the others? And if so, why?
Some of them look easier, and maybe possibly are. Some are certainly wider in terms of their draw. Some of the religious questions going over a number of different reigns of monarchy. That is possibly a bit more to chew on, but then again, it makes it more useful as a whole term project. For example, I know that Kett's Rebellion, I slightly to criticize the new textbook, even though I did push him on it. There isn't an awful lot in there, and if you choose Kett's Rebellion, you are going to have to do some more research to get enough information to do it very well. Another one is the Duke of Wellington, Arthur Wellesley. In the new textbook, he's there, but he's split up in various areas, and you have to hunt him down. But the thing is, you won't find much of him at all in the older textbooks. So, yes, you do have to think as you look what suits you. Really, your best move is to pick topics that actually you will interest your children and interest you too. Therefore, you're more likely to know more about it or know where to find it and be more successful with it.
Perfect. I love the idea of hunting Wellesley down. It's great. He's hiding, but he's definitely there. Great question here. How much background, causes and consequences do my pupils need to learn?
A lot. This is so much as this is analytical, that they've got to understand. For example, we were talking about the Battle of Hastings. They've got to understand the conditions that led to that battle, like Stamford Bridge, and the fact that the wind blew the wrong direction for William for a long time, so he couldn't arrive. So he came at a very useful time for him. And the consequences obviously depend. We had that question about William I. Depends upon, and Hastings, depends on the time scale. We're not expecting Hastings to have a consequence necessary about the Doomsday Book, but William I and what he did and what he achieved and the consequences going further definitely does need to be known too. So it's not just the core event. You need, that may be the kernel, but you've got to get everything else, all the food for the seed around it first. There's a good biological connection for you.
Perfect. Love it. Yeah. Cross-curricular. A lovely comment from Jonathan Spooner. Mr. Spooner, indicative content would be most helpful, especially for planning purposes. Great idea. So thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Jonathan. It's always good to hear what it is that schools need. So I think Bob and I will take that away and discuss it and chat to the team, because, as I say, we're really keen to be able to bring the wonderful CE to life through resources. So whatever we can do to help, we will certainly do so. So some more fab questions from people here. Will you be considering having 3 sources for the unseen evidence question? Visual evidence is so important, and it feels a bit restrictive to miss it out. It would also support weaker candidates to have 3 sources to consider and write about for that 14-mark question.
We thought very carefully about this. I have to admit, I was part of the setting team that first decided we would have some sort of picture in evidence questions a long time ago. And we had the naive impression this would be an easy thing for pupils to do. Over the years, we have found that there are exceptions. Visual sources have proven the most difficult for pupils to deal with, depending on the topic. But for example, political cartoons really can challenge even the best pupils. Also, we decided that we wanted to keep the evidence short, sharp, and sweet. And yes, 3 sources, I can understand that, but we're only allowing 20 minutes, and more sources takes more time, particularly for those who don't find reading and assessing the material very easy at all. So as of the moment, we haven't absolutely said there won't be any pictorial sources. It hasn't been completely forbidden, but it's not going to be very likely, I think, at the moment. That doesn't mean you can't be teaching that. There's absolutely no reason you shouldn't be using them as you practice using evidence work and developing their abilities. It just isn't probably going to be much in the exam.
Great. So we've got a lovely one coming from the chat here from Richard Gibson. How many words are pupils expected to write for part C of the essay question for 8 marks?
For 8 marks?
Part
Part
C.
C is not 8 marks.
Ah.
Part C, both part C's are 14.
Okay. Perhaps maybe Richard, if you just want to double check and clarify, and we can come back to that, because actually, Bob, it will not surprise you, I have a couple of questions on section C.
Okay.
One of which is, in section C of the source work, can pupils mention additional facts that would have been helpful in the sources but haven't been mentioned?
The fact that we're doing unseen sources is going to make that less likely it's going to happen. Okay. That's why we're doing unseen sources. So no one can say, oh no, they had an advantage because they already knew the topic. So that's why it's probably going to be pre or post. I mean, if they do know something, I don't think anybody's going to penalize them for it. But I think they're going to find, and I think this is something maybe I didn't make clear enough. One reason they need to practice these questions is an hour is a very short time to do this sort of stuff. And particularly with the source C questions, which are 14 marks each, where we're talking about really a mini essay of 2 paragraphs.
2 paragraphs.
Probably.
That's going to answer Richard's question.
Yeah.
He said, sorry, 14 marks. So yeah, about 2 paragraphs is your expectation for those 14 marks.
Yeah.
Okay. And there are some other questions. There's quite a lot of questions coming in about sources. Do you mention, or should pupils mention, the reliability of the sources in section C only? No,
in fact, usefulness is the key word, not reliability.
Right.
Usefulness, because hopefully as you teach them, they'll learn that a source could be useful even if it's not very reliable. It depends on the question.
Yeah.
I used to give the example of possibly slightly distasteful, but the example of a Nazi propaganda film, which I taught in a North London school with a lot of Jewish children. So I said, this is a propaganda film that is saying how the Jewish people are terrible, horrible people. And I said, we know that's not true. So this has to be a useless source. I said, if the question is, how did the Nazis develop a propaganda machine against the Jewish people, this is a useful source.
Yeah.
If it is, what is the truth about what the Jews were like in Germany, then it is not a useful source, and it's certainly not a reliable source. So it does depend on the question, and therefore the question's key is useful. Reliability plays a role, but it's not the key only factor there.
Perfect. So there's roughly how many quotations are you expecting in each section of the source work?
Some are useful, but if question 1 is only 2 points, it's a sentence. So if they can sneak in a little quote in there, fine.
Yeah.
Question sort B, 2 to 3 sentences. Again, maybe to show, if you could show a part of a quote that shows how they compare or contrast, that would be fine. I prefer I think quotations are useful and important, but not so much they tie themselves in the knots or spend too much time at it. This is the balancing act that they're going to have to learn.
Perfect. Will both sources always be written, or will there be the odd painting or map on occasion?
Well, that's back to this possible illustration. We certainly haven't said it won't happen, but at the moment, I think we're probably looking more at written sources.
Perfect. And I have one final question before we close for today, unless anybody else has anything else on the chat. And that is, will pupils have marks deducted for repeating facts in 2 or more sections of those essay questions?
Say that again, please.
Will pupils have marks deducted for repeating facts in 2 or more sections of the essay questions?
It depends on what specifically they're doing. There are some questions where, no, I don't think that'll be a problem. It's how they're using the facts, not so much that they're the same ones being used. Because if you mention 2 key events in a battle, and then what you've judged to be the most important event of the battle, and you pick one of those, that's fine, because that's what you've been asked to do. And then again, you may be using some of those facts in your argument about the final statement. So no, that won't necessarily be a problem. It depends on how they're being used, but no, it won't.
Perfect. Well, we are out of questions on the YouTube. I shall pad for a minute or so in case anybody else would like to come in with anything last minute for Bob. Bob, that was hugely informative, and not least in your ability to answer all of those burning questions I know people have with this new syllabus coming up. The ideas for resources are wonderful, and actually just a call to any of you listening this evening. If you have any ideas for the kinds of resources and material that you would like ISEB to produce that would support, then we would love to hear them, and you can send that into ISEB CPD, and Sophie and I will have a look at them, and we will always, it's always about us going to our brilliant team leaders to find out what's appropriate, what's going to be helpful, and what's really going to enhance your experience of those syllabuses. Last one from Mr. Spooner. Any plans for changing scholarship papers? So that one will be taken on by me. Yes, that is something that is on our roadmap to look at, because we know that we've made these changes to 13+, and then what we're going to do is continue to make sure that we can evolve what CE looks like to keep it as relevant and engaging for you guys as possible. So those scholarship papers will not be changing from September, but our aim is to start to have a look at those and make sure we can find out what you like about them, what you might need changing, and how we can keep those really relevant for you in the future. So I know that Bob and I will be getting together to look at those at some point soon. So Bob, thank you for brilliant couple of sessions. Listening to you and Claire and then you talk about this new syllabus really brings it to life. And I'm really loving the ideas that we've got for IPQ and resources too, to keep growing that impact of history in CE. So a huge thank you to all of you for joining us this evening. We always appreciate it. It's fabulous to see you and always get in touch with your questions. And Bob, as ever, absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank you.